What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the podcast, we are joined by Christian Smith. He's the William R. Keene Jr. Professor of Sociology and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of a whole bunch of books, but he's got a brand new one, Why Religion Went Obsolete, the Demise of Traditional Faith in America. It was quite a bit of fun to get to talk to him about this book, and the book is thoroughly excellent. If you are trying to understand and think through the changing nature of religion and culture in our time, and just what's going on in the cultural zeitgeist, then this book brings together a whole bunch of different research, data, and brings it together with a framework to think about what's going on in history, what are the cultural moves and changes, and what are the intuitions that have morphed, making religion as traditionally gathered, practiced, and enacted in America's history so different, so seemingly obsolete. It was a blast to talk to him, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. You definitely want to check out the book, Why Religion Went Obsolete. And well, anyway, thanks for listening. Enjoy the conversation. And let me know what you think. Reach out, let us know, and maybe even do something wild and crazy, like share the brew. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is Christian Smith. He's got a brand new book about why religion went obsolete, and which is, a bit depressing if you have a religion podcast. But hopefully the trends don't eliminate the ability to pay for my kids' health insurance. But you're not the cause of it, just the descriptor. I thought a place to begin this question is for you to talk about how the origin of this book formed for you as a sociologist, and how looking at the data, the big data sets, and then doing interviews, how does a sociologist seek to frame the question of the changing nature of religion?
Sure. Yeah, so we have been accumulating pretty strong empirical evidence for quite a while now, political scientists, sociologists, others, telling us that organized religion or traditional religion has been in, let's use the word decline, for quite a while now. The growth of the religious nuns, the so-called nuns, they say they're none of the above, started in 91 and has just been growing ever since. Recently, Pew issued a study saying maybe it's leveling off, but I'm not sure. But attendance at religious services is down, belief in God is down, belief in clergy have high ethical standards is down. Like at pretty much any measure you look at, American religion's been in decline. And that's a change from before, because we used to have this idea that America was an exceptional case. Europe would decline, Australia, etc. But there's something about America was an exception, and we would stay highly religious. But that has been pretty well shown not the case. So the problem is we have a lot of evidence that shows the decline, but relatively little thinking out and explaining why. What's the cause? Why and how has this happened? And so knowing religion has declined is great, so to speak, but we have something to explain, but now we need to explain it. So this book is an attempt to sort of capitalize on all the knowledge we have so far and explain the why, try to make sense of why this would happen. The other thing is, it seemed to me that the answer would have to be complicated, that there wouldn't be a simple answer. We'd have to figure out the time frame and what kind of things could cause this, and not just give associations of things that might correlate, but spell out causal mechanisms that would explain all of this. And so that's what my book is. And one of the moves that I make in this is to shift central focus away from sort of organizational numbers and individual metrics, like what do you believe or how often do you pray. The organizational numbers are like how many members do you have and how many adherents and what's the attendance. I, in this book, shift away from that focus to the realm of culture, both personal culture, that is people's working knowledge, but even more so the macro culture, the sort of the environment that all this happened in. And in doing so, I try to rehabilitate this old concept of zeitgeist. And I argue that There was something I call a millennial zeitgeist that emerged in the 90s and especially in the early 2000s that made religion obsolete. It made it mismatched. It didn't match with the culture. It was crowded out by a lot in the culture. It became polluted, is another word I use in the larger culture. So yeah, that's the summary of what I'm trying to do and first steps in how I go about it.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned there that you spend some time in the book doing is drawing a distinction between the kind of trajectory of obsolescence and kind of traditional secularization thesis.
Oh,
And you say that something more complicated and interesting has transpired that requires a
yeah.
more creative conceptual description than traditional secularization theory offers. And I wonder, when you think of the different attempts at explanation within your field, what was lacking in these other accounts of these transitions that had this turn towards thinking about the role of culture and wanting to develop, rehabilitate zeitgeist?
Yeah. There's a couple pieces of the answering that. The first piece is I argue, and I think I show that religious decline does not produce the gain of secularism. So we long have operated with a kind of a binary model that religion and the secular are kind of competing against each other. They are basically the players. And it's almost like an American football game. You know, one team has the ball, they're trying to gain some ground. The other team, every yard gained, the other team loses. And that binary may have worked in the past, but it's just oversimplistic for our culture today, which is much more complicated. So, one of the things I argue is that many of the people, or if not most, who have departed religion have gone into what I'm calling re-enchanted culture, or I can also call it occulture, which is not the occult, but a culture of the occult, and the occult here meaning hidden, not scary leaders that make you drink Kool-Aid. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, out on this football field, a whole group of people have come down out of the stands and have defected from the other game that was being played and have started playing a very different sort of game out on the same field. So now there's at least three major players. I'm sure there's more, but this is how I'm framing it. So it's not that religion loses, everyone becomes sort of a Dawkins follower or just a complete non. Most Americans still want to live lives of significance, of mystery, of believing there's some larger meaning to things above the horizon of the present. And so the phrase spiritual but not religious, people we know have been calling themselves spiritual at vastly increasing rates. Most of my colleagues have studied that as if it's kind of like a quasi new denomination. Who are these spiritual but not religious? Like it's an isolated group. But I'm saying spiritual is part of a larger cultural complex that also connects to paganism and crystals and alternative healing and Eastern religions. And there's a very long list that I'm calling re-enchantment. So that's the first point, is that it's not necessarily that we're becoming more secular just because religion loses. The second point is most traditional secularization theory has been framed in the terms of, I would say, 19th century positivist models of how society works, evolutionary positivism, where we're looking for some general laws of social life that will apply. So that the original idea was it's almost inevitable that the more modern a society becomes, the more a sort of a set of abstract forces come to play: rationalization, division of labor, belief implausibility, etc. Science takes over, this sort of thing, and that this is kind of inevitable, and that this will play out similarly in pretty much anywhere in the world that's modernizing. It's very much based on a handful of countries in Europe. And again, we always thought the US was different, but something different now, that's not really true. So what I'm claiming, though, and the kind of focus I want to give, and what I've always said about secularization theory, is we should stop looking for kind of the laws of social life, like things that will happen everywhere in similar ways. And we should think of secularization as a set of causal mechanisms, specific causal mechanisms that play out oftentimes, but not always, in different combinations, but that they are also working with and against other causal mechanisms that strengthen religion, that are neutral toward religion. And the world is this complex arena of multiple causal mechanisms at work, only some of which are secularizing. And so therefore that requires us to get down to more specifics of history and analyze Which of these causal mechanisms were triggered, under what conditions, and why? What did they produce, and why did that have the outcomes that they're saying? So I want to enter in a lot more, compared to traditional secularization theory, which I was raised on. I want to bring in a lot more complexity, contingency, path dependence, and contextual situation. So the story in my book is very much about America. It wouldn't be reproduced somewhere else. We had Jerry Falwell say, and he wasn't somewhere else. So it's a very particularly American story. So yeah, that's another way. I'm rejecting the larger sort of background philosophy of social science positivist approach to secularization. So you put those together. I'm framing it differently, and I don't think the secular has actually gained all that much from religion's decline. Therefore, I want to turn attention to re-enchantment and a culture and other movements that I think is where it's kind of the growth industry, or where the action is going.
Maybe it helped to kind of give a little more a thick account of what you mean by religious obsolescence, because
Yeah.
in the book you talk about how religion's been superseded by alternatives that most users deem preferable, and one of the analogies you use is the automobile versus the horse and buggy.
Yeah.
And obviously when you get a car, you're not like, well, screw horses, I hate buggies, they're oppressive.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so how does that concept of obsolescence involve not just like a decreased use, but also a mental shift where religion becomes less likely to just cross people's minds as a solution to the question?
Yeah, good question. So the main sort of adjective, the main word people use to describe what's happening, as I've already said, is decline. And decline fits organizational metrics. You can show them on a graph. You can give them quantitative numbers. If you get into the realm of culture and a zeitgeist, it becomes a different beast. Things don't just decline in culture. They have feels. There are eras of culture. Also, in my book, very important is the idea of generation. So most of this is playing out along generational lines. The younger, the more disaffected from religion. And so by obsolescence, I mean that intentionally as an alternative term to decline, to try to capture this idea that forces, technological developments, economic developments, different fashions, even different things, put some products or experiences or genres out of business. Basically, the definition in the book is obsolete is when most people feel it's no longer useful or needed because something else has superseded its function. It feels old-fashioned. There's some other style or innovation that has superseded it. Now, that's meant to convey two things, as you say. One is that has more to do with people's sensibilities, people's affective reactions to things, what does and doesn't make sense. I know this is not a very sociological term, but for millennials and Gen Zers, like what vibes or doesn't vibe is really important. It's probably more important than what are the probabilities that a God exists in this universe, in this reality. So I'm trying to get to the notion that religion just has sort of, another image I use is Western movies. Like Western movies can be great movies. We've made them for a long time. They were huge in the 50s. And then with the exception of a few great ones in the 70s, Western movies just went obsolete. Like people are not dying to see Western movies and people chasing each other on horses and so on. So something similar to what happened to Western movies. Why do they feel old-fashioned, and I'm saying is about traditional religion. So the second piece of this that you alluded to is obsolete doesn't mean extinct. Obsolete doesn't mean any less useful or valuable. The main image I use is what desktop computers did to electric typewriters. I learned to type on electric typewriter in high school, and that was great. And I'm sure there's still a lot of electric typewriters in closets that work perfectly well, but we don't use them because something else has come along that sort of pushes them aside, and that's the desktop computer and now laptops and iPads. So the point is, traditional religion isn't extinct. Many people still practice it, a minority of people, a decreasing minority, so to speak. And Just like I have boxes of DVDs and CDs in my closet. Like I haven't gotten rid of them, and I might take them out and listen to them rather than streaming music or movies if I want to. In my area of the country, there are still literally people that ride horses and buggies in Indiana. There are Mennonites and conservative Mennonites and Amish. So, and horses and buggies apparently get them around great, and they're better for the like. To say obsolete is to not say, again, not to say extinct, not to say nobody has any interest or uses it. A lot of people still, there are probably people still type letters on electric typewriters. You know, Wendell Berry wrote a famous essay, why I'm not getting a personal computer. So it helps to explain why religion is still around. Some people are invested in it, etc., but it isn't culturally at a macro cultural level in the sense of sensibilities and the feel and the spirit of the age. It's kind of like Western movies and the electric typewriter.
Yeah.
The other point of obsolescence, not to extend this at too much depth, but many things require others to be involved in them for them to work well. So you take electric typewriter, you need to replace the ribbon. If it breaks, you need a repair person. You may need to order a part, et cetera, et cetera. And the more obsolete something becomes, not only the less people think about it or use it, but the less like infrastructural support there is to make it work. So if you're a Gen Zer, you may want to be very religious, but what's around you in terms of your peers, the culture, the values, what you're encouraged to make with your life, doesn't support it like it would have in the past.
Yeah, no, and that's a real a real challenge. I did a survey, for there's 80,000 people on the email list, and I think like 1,500 or so responded, and it was a survey about like the challenges one faces for their faith. Right? And these are people that choose to listen to multiple hour conversations with academics, and the most.
Wait a minute, isn't the average American like that? Really?
Yeah. But
I'm sorry.
The biggest challenge named the moment you go under 40 is any in-person physical community where they live, right? That like the churches that maybe like agree with their more progressive account of the faith are really boring, small, and mostly old, and the ones that's aesthetic or something they might be able to handle have all the theological convictions that make them run.
Yeah.
And so, out of that, like we started this event for the podcast back in 2016 called Theology Beer Camp, and it's grown to the point that every year 600 people show up, and so many of them are like, oh, it's the only time I get 3 days where I can walk around and I know I have something in common with my faith and the other people that are there.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that example of like the ribbons or how you get the ink and all that kind of stuff, I think is really helpful. Or someone gives me a CD and I go, well, I'd love to listen to your music, but that would require a CD player.
Right,
And
exactly.
I guess I could borrow my son's car.
I used to show DVD documentaries in some of my classes, and then suddenly all the DVD players disappeared from every classroom. So, okay, I guess this library I accumulated is obsolete. It still works. I could still watch them. It's just, and people do, like I said, but it doesn't have the same status.
Yeah. When I was reading it, I kept thinking of how many leaders of denominations or theological education I would really like just to spend a minute there, because it seems that there's this entire drive for being one of the denominations or churches or theological institutions that survive the culling of, as opposed to going, well, why are we still training people for a form of religion when everyone had typewriters? But there the incentive structures built around it, because the people that still go to those churches love typewriters. They're like, this is great. This is why I'm here.
Or some of the people that still go, and especially those with power who have been around for a longer time, that's what they want. Yeah, so there are organizational expressions of this. In the book, I talk about how if you came of age pre-internet, you have a certain model of how organizations work, and you're comfortable with that, and it has its own timetable and so on. If you were raised on the internet, that model feels totally old and oppressive, and you operate by networks, and networks operate differently organizationally than brick and mortar, top down, bottom up structures. So I do not in this book say, here's what the church should do. Like, it's not my business. But all of this, like the technology has ramifications for how people think about who they are, what a good life looks like, what kind of even if they're not even aware of it, what kind of organization they're comfortable with. Other things are just, you walk into a congregation and does it feel like you could jive there? And so for millennials, how much diversity is there? Millennials are the most racially, ethnically diverse cohort so far, and they're used to that at work, in school. And they go into church, it's all a bunch of middle-aged white people. They're not going to like it. It's not that they're going to be like, I don't like this, is socially unjust or something. They're just going to be like, this doesn't feel comfortable to me. Or another thing I point to is changes in family formation and romantic relationships. So these are long-term trends, but millennials grew up in a world where you didn't just like graduate high school, marry your sweetheart, settle down, and have a family in suburbia. The growth, the rise of divorce, of never getting married, of delayed marriage, of voluntary childlessness, single parents, etc. That changes the demographics. It has changed the demographics profoundly. Meanwhile, most, I think, traditional religious groups, congregations, are still set up for the traditional family. If you go in and listen to the announcements, even, everything revolves around like their kids' school schedules and this and that. So there are these very subtle ways that I think people can feel like, yeah, this isn't going to be the right thing for me.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier kind of the for the larger thesis, having this wide range of causal factors is important. And you've mentioned a few of them there. The list I made when running through it, you mentioned like higher education rates for the masses, women entering the workforce, the deinstitutionalization of marriage and family. You touched on there, the kind of triumphant mass consumerism, intensifying the expressive individualism, and the rise of extended adolescence or emerging adulthood. I think all of those there's some reference that pops in most people's mind when you say them. But when you're making that list going into this project and then doing the research, are there particular causal factors you didn't anticipate having the significance that you or your peers thought they would the moment you start to think, how do they generate a zeitgeist?
Yeah, there wasn't anything like, "Oh, I'd never thought of that." I mean, there were a number of years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago, I gave a presentation on the rise of the nuns. And when I was thinking that through, I realized, 1991 was the year when the nuns started rising in national surveys, was also the end of the Cold War, and a lot of other things happened in history. So that just got me thinking. My general pitch to the funder for this is if you want to understand what's going on inside religion, you have to most understand what's going on around religion, outside religion. So, yeah. The other thing I should say is I'm not a traditional secularization theorist. I've spent my career being skeptical about secularization theory. So for me to come around to, American religion's gone obsolete, that's kind of a shift for me, even if I still am not buying secularization theory in its traditional terms. So which is, to answer your question, like I've always had hunches about most of these things. Some of them are better developed than others. Writing this project, and I've been working on it for a number of years, this project gave me the chance or the obligation to sit down and really think very hard and dig much deeper into, okay, what would it be about September 11, or what would it be about changing family structures, or the end of the Cold War, or the rise of mass consumerism? Again, you think, okay, so people buy a lot of stuff and we're kind of materialistic. What does it have to do with the church on Elm Street? I don't know. So I had a lot of hunches, and this was an opportunity to sit down and work out those hunches. Some of them I had ideas for, and I kind of threw them out. Others I didn't have very well developed in my head. For example, one of the most important factors in all this is the digital revolution, right? The internet, social media. I mean, I had a sensibility from when I was studying teenagers that this is probably not a very faith reinforcing technology. But here I had to sit down and read and think hard about what is it about the internet that would undermine religion's appeal, that would make it seem. And I came up with a list of 10 causal mechanisms, 10 distinct things that I'm arguing it did this and this and this and this. And once you understand that, you see, oh, okay, that that contributed significantly to obsolescence. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I liked about you kind of have this combination, right, of these causal factors and then these events that take place in the 90s and early aughts that generate this spirit of the ages zeitgeist. But like even the one right there of the digital revolution, when you're looking at these different features of it, or you're looking at these causal factors, you kind of consistently analyze how do these shape the context in which the human beings live rather than the content of what they may or may not believe.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the gifts that sociologists and religion give in general is by continuing to remind us that the medium of the way we relate as a people and the context in which we find ourselves is actually more influential on what the live possibilities for living are than the particular content. And so much
Yeah.
of culture dominant Christianity in America are arguments about particular contents where you end up with 7 kinds of Baptists within a square mile and they have really important debates, or our denomination split over these different content things. And as someone who's like tried to introduce the kind of wisdom of sociology to religious people on a regular basis, like what's most annoying or revelatory about our stubbornness on that kind of context content distinction?
There's definitely a bias in religion, especially religious leaders, toward sort of a cognitivist, intellectualist, especially if you're interested in doctrine, et cetera, or ethics, or church history, whatever. To think, people work things out in their head, but most people don't work things out in their heads. They have relationships, and then beliefs tend to follow from their relationships. They swim in oceans that have different temperatures and different currents, and that affects sort of where they go. One of the things I critique in the end of the introduction is this idea that I think a lot of religious leaders have, which I call program idealism and doctrinal idealism or theological. Like if we just get the right ideas, then we'll straighten everything out. We'll be a faithful church, and our kids will stay in youth group. Or if we just come up with the right program that'll be snazzy and attractive and glitzy, whatever it is. I just think that is operating on the wrong model. So again, here I'm trying to introduce what I call sociological realism that focuses more on what's going on around religion. How is the culture, even a very hard to describe and put your finger on, a zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, sort of what's in the cultural atmosphere. We know it's very real because we experience it. We wrestle with it. Everybody has to. Unless you're totally living under a rock, things changed in the 90s and 2000s. And so what I'm trying to do is to explicate transformations in the culture that would make somebody saying, I think I'm actually spiritual, intelligible. Like, given if somebody was raised in this situation, why would it make sense really for them to say, I'm not religious anymore, or I'm spiritual, or whatever they end up saying? Yeah, so that's sociology is about context. It's about understanding the social interactive. And so my argument here is that the social changes didn't have to turn on a dime. These are long-term. They're highly complex. They're multiple. One thing I stress is they're mostly unintended. Like, we know what planned obsolescence is. They build something so it'll break and you have to buy a new one. I'm saying this is mostly not planned obsolescence. Most of the people who were behind the changes that happened that affected culture didn't think about religion or its consequences for religion. They were interested in making money or developing technologies or ending a war or whatever they were doing. And yet some of the most important things that happen in life are unintended consequences. In an individualistic culture, a psychological culture, we oftentimes miss those. So my job is to help people see the larger social forces at work here and to say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I could see now looking back why.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that I do think that the way you describe the unplanned nature of obsolescence is helpful, and that it's part of larger societal and cultural shifts, because often religious leaders make it personal and intentional. Though,
Yeah.
it's just an expression of the psychological mechanisms every human being has. But
Yeah. No, I mean, very early on, I gave a presentation about this at a divinity school, and there's a couple pastors showed up, and they were like, after I was done, they came up and said, Thank you so much. We thought it was all our fault. Like, how had we struggled for years? How had I failed in my calling as a pastor? I'm like, you don't deserve that much credit negatively. Like, you didn't fail. You probably did your best. The world around you is transformed and you're up against titanic forces. So yeah, which is not to say everybody's helpless. People still make decisions in these contexts, but the context affect how reasonable different decisions can make.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember I was at a clergy conference I think it was at Princeton, and there were a lot of church planners there. And I think it was Gerardo Marti, who's a sociologist, when they were talking about
Mhm.
which church succeed or not. And he goes, well, really, it's the ones that plant in places with middle class families, where middle class families are growing, because you're more likely to participate in a church if you're married, have a
Yeah,
graduate degree, and these kind of things. It's not, and that does not correspond to the presence of the Holy Ghost, and yet so many of the vocational narratives a clergy will tell, they're like, oh, I must be doing like a really good job, and you had the right zip code, as opposed to
yeah.
other places.
Yeah, so I really think it's valuable. Like, sociology isn't everything, demography isn't destiny, but it really needs to be understood so we don't overinflate our ability to think we're doing things or work without a context. Another version of this, the implication of my story, because I say a lot of the evangelical jumping into politics and the rise of the Christian right and the religious right and now Christian nationalism, but that's not in my time frame. There was a huge reaction against that. There was a blowback against the Christian right, which drove a lot of people away from Christianity. And so, but one of the larger implications of my story is, there's a lot of conservative religious people who will want to say, all of this is happening because of some kind of conspiracy of secular humanists or Hollywood or whoever else. I mean, conspiracies have gotten so insane anymore, but it's specifically out to get us, groups of people, and they've taken over the universities, they've taken over the media, and that's why we're in big trouble. My story is, no, that's a part of the story. It's a little tiny piece of it, but even without that, most of the stuff would have happened. So don't try to blame some kind of identifiable enemy that's out to, you know, subvert you. Most of this is unintended. It's just the way history came together. And the other piece of it, there's a whole chapter on how religion shot itself in the foot or the chest, or how bad it was. Religion itself did tons to contribute to its own obsolescence. The religious scandals, for one thing, but not just that. I have a long list of things that been missteps that traditional religions made, especially American evangelicalism, that really, really, really hurt traditional religion, much more than the new atheists or secular humanist writings or
Yeah.
something like that.
No, I really enjoyed, whatever.
Yeah, that's every time I give this book to someone, I put enjoy in quotes. It's like, enjoy.
But in chapter 8, where you're looking at religious self-destructions, I appreciate it because they're self-inflicted wounds, right? So often,
Yeah,
and this isn't just religious people. I think this is actually a kind of culturally ubiquitous feature of the millennial zeitgeist. People come up with all sorts of ways that they're the victim of someone else in
yeah,
order to kind of legitimate themselves and whatever the loss or lack of traction that they have. And you talk about the religious scandals, but there are a host of other elements. You talk about the kind of intensity of me and God spirituality,
mhm,
the mission drift that takes place, and even you talk about you bring back up there something you mentioned earlier in the kind of more historical section, that even like prosperity gospel TV preaching, right? Like using this new technology at one point seemed like a boom for evangelicalism, but it actually
mhm.
ended up undermining it. So I wonder if
Yeah.
you might kind of talk about the way in which the self destruction element shows up as a consequence of deliberate decisions religious communities have made engaging the cultural transformations.
Yeah, yeah. So say take the last thing you mentioned in evangelicalism, televangelism, mega churches, seeker churches. I mean, my story is that basically that somewhat worked with boomers. If you get a pastor who's who's hip and wearing a Hawaii shirt and jeans or whatever,
I've seen one of
and it
those.
feels like Yeah, like that worked. This is part of where generations come in. That works for a certain generation who has a certain orientation, but then along come millennials. Gen Xers are the pivot of all this. Like they pivot from one to the other and really unlock and open the door for millennials. Millennials come along and they're like, I don't want to be in a church of 20,000 people. This is ridiculous. Or take the me and God spirituality, which is another evangelical thing. So I try to explain evangelicals have long used this language since at least World War II that it's not good enough to believe in God. You have to have a personal relationship with Jesus, that's the mark of an authentic Christian. And my argument is that was so diffused in the culture so successfully that now what we have are people that say, I have a personal relationship with God, therefore I don't need to go to church. And who their God might be is what they've decided God is like, not what Scripture says or denomination teaches. So nobody who said, let's use the language of personal relationship with God as a way to sort of drive people to personal commitment. Nobody in evangelicalism who said that historically thought, wow, this could get out of hand and people will use it against the church, against theology. But lo and behold, that's what happened. It was like, you're too successful. Like your discourse has been exported and taken over by other people who are putting it to totally different uses than you originally intended.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me think of one of the. You have a few metaphors in the first half of the book. Oh, I don't know. If I came up with them, I would just kind of pat myself on the back and be done for the day. Be like, oh, yeah, I know how this is going to go. And one of them is the way you draw on the analogy of population ecology when looking at the kind of complex ways cultures change, and in looking at, say, invasive species or forms of pollution, and looking at our the religious
Pathogens.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, what forms of these elements, even if they're unintended or unexamined, do you believe had the most impact on America's kind of cultural ecosystem?
Which of the causal factors, or are you still on the religious self-destruction chapter?
Oh, well, I was thinking that when I thought of the ecology, like the example you gave, like the me and God type thing, right? It has this introduction. It thrives, right? Take the Jesus People movement. It generates an entrepreneurial spirit for like the purpose driven, or we can go through these big mega churches that then set up effective ways of church planning for baby boomers, right? And then their Gen X kids are like, that's not authentic. Dear God, you want us to look like we're like retired and live in Southern California?
Yeah. Jimmy Buffett.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what starts as this invasive species where it grows and it's thriving and it has a niche. Then that niche actually destroys a place where their own kids can find a faith kind of an element. And I just, because you introduced that metaphor so early, it kind of kept showing back up in my head when processing the larger historical narrative you tell.
Yeah, so in one of the early chapters, I lay out a whole bunch of metaphors. It's kind of sociological theory, but not in the traditional sense, because I think that what actually happened in history, there are questions of timing and delays of causes. For example, a lot of these forces have been at work for a long time. And most of the deep cultural changes, actually, the parents of the millennials started the ball rolling in the 60s and 70s. I argue the 80s sort of put a temporary hold on it. But so I think some of these metaphors help us to understand like tipping points. Things can be developing for a very long time and without there having any apparent consequences of change. Then you hit a tipping point or a saturation point, and then you hit a certain level quantitatively, and then everything changes qualitatively. Like you get over the hump and now you're rolling down the other side. So
that's like the avalanche metaphor.
Yeah, another metaphor is the avalanche. Like the conditions have got to be just right if an avalanche is going to happen. Like a lot of things have got to be set up just right. But then to start it, all you need is a couple people skiing, near the top, or a hunter shooting a rifle, and then it starts to break and go down, and then it just pulls and pulls and pulls most down. So another example, I don't think it was like the most important one, but another thing I talk about in the religious self-destructions is the evangelical purity movement, sexual purity campaigns of this era. And, this was a response to spreading pornography and loosening sexual morals and all this stuff. But it just, the way it was mostly evangelical, some Catholic, the way it was played out, the kids, many kids went along with it. And then after a little while, they were like, this is crazy. This is oppressing me. This is screwing up my head about what sex is. This is, some kids would say this like ruined my marriage. I went into marriage with the totally the, and so there was a huge backlash against it. And lots of, especially evangelical women, and since women tend to be more religious historically than men, like these are the last ones you want to lose. So women writing the purity movement was terrible. So this, and then that got institutionalized in institutes and therapy for spiritual recovery and toxic religion and all this stuff. And that all happened against the backdrop of what I call a third sexual revolution, where the society around was transforming around pornography and booty calls and lots and lots and lots of changes around belief norms and interests, practices around sexuality. In that case, evangelicalism was reacting against it. But that reaction, just like the Christian right produced its own pushback, it produced a huge amount of pushback among the kids it was supposed to keep pure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ironies in this story. There's a lot of unanticipated, like again, back to the Christian right. I mean, they were trying to save America for God, and their biggest effect was to pound hard at the top of the avalanche and start a slide of ice coming down that picked up a lot of people, and they ended up pushing tons of people away from God and the church and Christianity. So irony.
Yes. In chapter 4, you talk about this kind of dynamic between mass consumerism, which generates this redefinition of the good life with an emphasis on material acquisition, and it comes into conflict with some traditional religious views, and expressive individualism, which exists culturally prior, but then becomes culturally available to a growing number of people. And so how did its resurgence, that individualism in a context of mass consumerism in the 90s and 2000s, how did that reshape the cultural conversation around values? You talk about post-materialist values, but can you kind of describe the emergence of a different way of framing values and how it undermines the appeal or authority of traditional religious traditions?
These things have deep roots in Emersonian transcendentalism and so on. So I don't want to suggest that all this just came into being in the 90s. But there's a theory in political science, a guy named Ronald Inglehart has this theory of materialist and post-materialist values. What he really means by materialist is scarcity. So they're civilizational orientation. Some of them are oriented towards scarcity. And what they do is they make people most interested in material security, physical security, sort of national security, defense, making sure you don't starve, making sure you're not rot. Like it's concerned with that. And then post-scarcity values are more about expressive. It's expressively individualistic, but expressing oneself, finding one's true inner nature, one's authentic self. And that has a tendency to it's very much romantic movement influenced. It has a tendency to emphasize who is my uniquely authentic self, and how do I need to live and express that authentic self in my life? Nobody else should get in the way. All this takes place in the context of what I call pop postmodernism, where this generation is trained, distrust authorities, and of course, the distrust of institutions is widespread and long term. So distrust authorities. So when all this wraps up together, millennials, most of them are like, nah, I want to live an authentic life. Like I'm not going to be told by someone else what to do. I'm suspicious of external authorities, much less ones like the Bible or something that's been around for thousands of years that are probably out of date. I have to figure out my own journey on my own. And no matter what the cost, I have to express what feels subjectively authentic to me. That may be art, that may be rebellion, it may be going off into the woods and living a simple life in a cabin. It could be lots of different things, but it basically orients the people in a culture toward, you're an individual, you're a unique individual, don't let anybody get in the way. You have a moral obligation to express your unique individuality, be suspicious of authorities and especially institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That traditional religion, when you set all this picture down and figure out how does what people's expectations, this is another important piece of this. Americans have certain images in their heads or expectations of what religion is and does. All of this I just described doesn't match up with that. So there's a mismatch. It's one of the other images I use. There's a cultural mismatch between everything in this millennial zeitgeist and what millennials or post-boomers think traditional religion is about. Whether or not it is a separate question or needs to be, but what's in their heads traditional religion is, it just doesn't match with where they're going, who they are, what they're up to.
So, what role did the moralizing of religion and the downplaying of transcendence play in this transition?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, but I've long since I studied the spiritual lives of teenagers, I had this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism. That was the true religion of young people. The idea is most Americans, the first thing they think of religion is supposed to be doing is make people be good, help them make good choices, be nice, be good examples, not screw up their lives, basically. It's a resource for being a good, nice, happy person. That totally de-emphasizes anything beyond that. Well, first of all, the definition of what's good and nice is the bar is set pretty low. It's not love your enemy or give away half your wealth or pray for your persecutors. It's, don't be an asshole, basically, is what it is. So if religion is just helps people be good and moral, then increasingly what happened in the millennial zeitgeist is people said, well, you don't have to be religious to be good. There are a lot of not religious people who are good. And actually, there are a lot of religious people who aren't good. Look at all the priest abuse scandals and all these nasty things going on in religion. And so religion kind of discredits itself against that popular standard in its head about what religion is. And then there's a whole movement of many books and discussions, public discussions about good without God. You can be good without God. And I think people who weren't religious felt insulted that you must be somehow morally defective if you're not religious, if you don't have God. And there was a strong pushback against that influenced a lot of young people. I also argue in kind of parallel form that I have weaker data on this, but I think it's something that's gone on. And I try to show over time, American traditional religions de-emphasized what I call transcendent themes: salvation, eternity, heaven, hell, judgment day, like beyond history, beyond this world, the afterlife, or maybe in this world, the power of the Holy Spirit to personally experience and have things transformed or be healed. I think in their effort to make Christianity, let's say, palatable to moderns, to modern secularists, like, oh, we're not dumb. You could be a modern person and still believe this. There was a little bit too much bending over backwards to hide uncomfortable notions that I'm calling transcendent. And that kind of depleted religion's ability to make claims about what they have to offer. Like, okay, you offer a daycare. Anybody can do that. You help people make good choices. Lots of people and institutions do that. Like if you get rid of the realities or the proposed, the supposed realities of an afterlife and a real God and claims on life and moral demands and eternity and the Holy Spirit in real life, or whichever version you want, then the churches and other religious congregations come off to most people as just another nice community organization that you may, like the tennis club or the YMCA, you may or may not want to be part of it, but it doesn't have any patent on any product that's distinctive. It doesn't own any corner on any market. So I'm not saying, let's start preaching hell. Everybody should start preaching hell. That'll turn it around. I'm not sure anything will turn anything around, but I do think that the backing away from ownership of transcendence is part of the story. I would also say that connects to the being spiritual and a culture and re-enchantment. There's a lot of people who are really dying for, or they spend all their free time watching shows about demons and the supernatural and vampires and aliens from outer space. Like there's actually a demand for weird, preternatural, unexplainable things in life. But in moving in the opposite direction, I think most or many, if not most, mainstream religious traditions have sort of emptied themselves of that. Somewhere way in the back closet, the Catholic Church still owns exorcism, but for the most part, that's all sort of done away with, and the emphasis on we're happy, we're good, we'll help your children grow up and be successful. The competition wipes you out.
Yeah. In chapter 5, when you're talking about mainline Protestantism and the way there's this kind of cultural triumph and organizational decline when their values become mainstream, that was something, as someone who grew up a Baptist preacher's kid, who was a church planter, and then we were excommunicated from enough denominations for inclusivity and such. You end up hanging out with that you meet everyone in the emerging church movement and mainline Protestants, and then you show up there and you realize that your clergy peers in mainline Protestantism cross their fingers when they say the word God and couldn't tell you anything God did, right? And then you're surprised at the outcome.
Yeah.
But part of that, I think, is this sense that in the Enlightenment, when the church is culture dominant, it thinks, let us remove as many barriers between the average subject and participation. And for evangelicals, that meant kind of aesthetic barriers. And for more mainline Protestants, it was like, well, this commitment's awkward. This thing is, so we're gonna keep shrinking it down. Let Kant tell us exactly what we can say theologically, emphasize the morals, and make sure there's a pride flag nearby because we're better than those crazies. And the result ends up, as someone who was a youth minister for 15 years, realizing that none of the other staff at the church had an answer to why we were there. And in fact, the parents were perfectly cool if they just came to all the stuff I was in charge of and not worship. And if they're only going to come once a week, we're going to educate them until they go to college. Then they get to join worship. And I just thought that sitting there, taking cognitive science classes in my PhD program, going, this is just bad for passing on the faith. Like you don't educate them into a being that could worship. You don't intellectualize any unique claim you have out of the building. But I wonder, when you look at the consequences of that, what has to happen for those kind of a priori commitments for that to make sense, to be questioned? Or would you go as a sociologist, don't waste time with them, even though they still have some funding, go do something different?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as I said, I'm a sociologist. My job is to explicate what the problems are, not to have any solutions. But if you understand the problems, you can begin to wrestle with solutions. But just as you're saying, that in the early chapter where I lay out, here's what Americans think makes religion good. If religion does this, then it's good. Most of those things they don't contradict what most traditional religions teach, but they're really not what those traditions are about. They're sort of a bastardized, watered down, serve me please form of what those religions might be about. And so I think part of what's happened over time is this reciprocal or dialectical, in order to not lose people or alienate people, or in order to seem respectable, especially to the more intellectual or educated types of modernity, churches have accommodated X, Y, and Z. And that, in effect, has trained Americans. Here's what you should expect from us. You shouldn't expect anything more demanding or crazy sounding. And then Americans say, okay, this is what we expect. And then what happened, again, back to my larger story, what happened in the 90s and 2000s is almost all those things that Americans expect from religion were corroded, corrupted, undermined, and negated. So again, it's not that people back in the old days should have anticipated that, but that so I would put it this way, sociologically speaking even, if you let others like Immanuel Kant or postmodernists or whoever determine sort of your standards for what you're willing to accept or preach or believe or stand for, you're going to be in the end led around the field like a cow or a pig by the nose and end up not doing very successfully. So if anything, I think churches or traditional religion needs to step back and say, really at heart, who are we, and what things could we lose that are getting in the way, that are not essential to who we are? They're just cultural obstacles. And I'm not saying I have a plan, or I really have no idea what to do, but it's going to require, from my point of view, sociologically, to turn anything around is going to require some pretty big, deep reconsideration of what things stand for, especially as boomers age and generations age and die off and are replaced by younger people who weren't raised that religious, and now they're having their own kids and not raising them religious. Yeah, it just doesn't look promising.
Yeah. One of the themes you raised in chapter 6 and is the role of kind of neoliberal capitalism. So I wonder
Mm-hmm.
in what specific ways the ascendance of that form of capitalism with its emphasis on work and intensification, mobility, individualistic competition, end up directly crowding out, and it's a language you use, religious participation and commitment.
Yeah. So just to use kind of an ideal type here, obviously life is more complicated, but prior to the rise of neoliberal capitalism through much of the 20th century, at least the middle of the 20th century, there was kind of a compact between workers and employers, corporations and labor. You could expect to have a job for a long time. You could settle in. It may be a lame job. It may be boring, but they'll stick with you, and you can keep manufacturing the cars in Detroit or whatever you do. There was a stability to it, and that lent itself to settling in, buying a house, becoming part of your community, including join a church, join a synagogue, whatever like that. So along comes neoliberal capitalism in the, it has its roots since the end of World War II, but it incubates for decades and finally it sort of hits the world in the under Reagan and Thatcher and just globalizes in the 90s and after. It transforms the conditions of labor. It transforms the compact between corporations and employees. There isn't security. You're probably going to have to change your work, upgrade your skills, be moved to another place, maybe be put out of business depending on your skills and your age. You're competing against your peers. Your bosses feel entitled to make more and more demands on you because if you don't work over the weekend, he or she can get someone else who will do that. So millennials grow up in an environment, not the former era, but one where they know it's both it's a fact of like survival in a career, and it becomes a psychological orientation of mobility, transience, a competition against others, readiness to move, don't get stuck, don't settle down, always be ready to overwork, to work too hard. And millennials moved geographically more than any other generation. So there's a lot of transience. Now, traditionally, it doesn't have to be this way in theory, but traditionally, traditional American religion is associated with settling down as an adult, becoming part of your community, growing up, having a family, sticking with a congregation for a good while, participating, maybe taking some leadership eventually. And neoliberalism just doesn't work with any of that. Like why should you join? Why should you start membership classes if you may be asked to relocate anytime? Or why should you join a Bible study if half the time it's scheduled you need to be working overtime, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah. So again, this is the sociological realism that I'm talking about. Nobody who was pushing neoliberal capitalism and globalization was like, this is going to have great unintended consequences to undermine religion. They weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about prosperity. But nevertheless, it has these unintended consequences. It affects people profoundly. And so individuals may be wrestling with, I wonder if there's a God, or would it bother my parents if I just dropped out of church or whatever. But the context also involves their sense of themselves, their career, their education. They have to stay in school longer, which delays settling down. All these forces in a social context driven by a globalized economic vision and system makes it intelligible to say, I really can't afford to get stuck here. I really can't afford to settle down. I need to be ready to move. And
Yeah.
transience and traditional religion don't go together.
Yeah, like that chapter I think was really helpful at even naming features of just me and my age cohort because though I will say Jesus was suspicious about mammon and God being compatible. So I don't
Yeah.
think we should be too
Yeah, there's no
surprised.
shock there.
Yeah, But one of the things in the public conversation right now about the impact of neoliberal capitalism, and it's made flat screen TVs really affordable, but no one's able to buy a house, right? And so you get these features when you're looking at religious participation data that, oddly enough, people with more education and go are going to actually show up at worship services, right? And you're like, well, that's weird because I thought science undermined it. But then there's
Yeah.
also this
Having a
element.
BA degree, especially having a bachelor's, is the most likely to attend.
Yeah, because you're more likely to have some form of economic stability, more likely to own a home, which makes you more invested in the community where like the function of religion, like there are all these elements to it, but the gigification of one's life, the sense that you're responsible for craft, self-creation, and you participate in a multiplicity of narratives, so it's hard for any of them to make a genuine claim on yourself or that community and things like. There are all these ways that neoliberal capitalism hooked up to a smartphone is making the whole next generation have some of these same problems. It's like they're avalanching, right?
Yeah, it's getting more intense. My Gen Z students tell me, who I talk to about this stuff, they say, "Oh yeah, this is exactly what we're dealing with. Only it's a lot more intense than millennials had it."
Yeah, and I don't think millennials are thrilled with it. I've even noticed it because our oldest, like we're the young parents for our kids, and especially when we lived in LA and Europe, because we're Southerners. So since True Love waited, it waited till 20. So just even our own suspicion towards the advice you give to your kids about career and work and taking out loans to do this, or the suspicions you have towards those narratives or technology are just really different than parents that are 10 years older than us. They're like saying things that we're looking at them like, why would you tell your kid that? I can't believe my parents told me this and my mentors told me this. It was horrible advice. And then you get a president where in the last 2 months, I've had 4 emails telling me my student loans could vary between $1,200. And you're like, I blame the boomers. They gave me this advice. So I wonder like what this experience of tracking this story for this generational shift, what's been the response of talking to your undergrad students who decide to take up, a sociology of religion class? When they hear that story, what parts of it seem explanatory for, their own religious experience with millennial and Gen X parents? And what are the kind of, what are the questions they know their parents haven't asked that they think, here's what we're losing sleep over, Dr. Smith?
Yeah, good question. Well, I have to say, I mean, the book is literally just being published like in today or in the next couple of days. So it hasn't been out. I haven't used it in a class. I did have a great team of Notre Dame undergrads who worked on this almost from the beginning. They were fantastic. And I think for them, it was mostly like learning the sociological perspective that shed light on their individual experiences. Like, oh, now I know why I have that tattoo, or, like why these. So for them, it was a great experience of sort of doing the bigger picture context. Notre Dame students are great. They're not like your typical college age student. They're not your typical college age American. So they're kind of a rarefied sample. And the kids I had have great parents too. So it's a little different, but I think they feel they learn about this stuff. They see this, they read this. We've talked about it. They hear others in interviews talk about it. I think their main reaction is like, oh boy, like what's going to be coming? One of them basically said, one of them who's very committed to the Catholic Church, she said, I think one of the things this shows is that the church has been terrible at educating people. Like people know almost nothing. People don't even know what they're rejecting. And so she's kind of appalled about that. And another one has parents who aren't particularly religious, and she's become more religious by being at Notre Dame and through all this. So I guess things vary widely. It's going to be very interesting to see how, if this gets assigned in any classes, how other college students will read this and react to it. I think one of the dynamics at work is these changes, like the internet, they're pretty well established now, and it seems like a long time ago when there wasn't an internet. But in the scale of history, I mean, these changes happened very rapidly, and their consequences were like enormous. So I'm old enough to remember there was a long time in my life before there was such thing as email. Like or there were payphones, or there was a land. So for me, I have enough perspective on this, but I think a lot of younger people especially millennials and especially Gen Z who grew up in this, they can't even imagine what's different. Like they have no points of reference or comparison to say, okay, this shouldn't be like this because it could be like that. It's just the way it is, and they feel again under the competition, they've got to scramble. They've got to make the best of it they can. Mostly feeling totally helpless and feeling like the world is increasingly getting out of control. So again, if you have youth who are struggling with climate grief, who feel like they have no power, the boomers who could make a difference don't really care about their futures, and they have anxiety and they have a lot of food allergies, which is just increasingly my observation. How does it like what's the appeal or what's the place or how does it fit to sort of like become a regular church attender? Maybe it is, but I think what they grew up with doesn't really work.
Last year, I did this giant audio documentary on the emerging church movement from like
Hmm.
its birth through like the whole process where by the end, you actually get, a group that migrates into mainline Protestantism, those that don't want to lose jobs and come up with creative ways of staying within evangelicalism or finding a place there. Then those that would sit in that re-enchantment space and there's all these different trajectories in it. But one of the features that was extremely or extremely clear after doing like 50 interviews with people that were a part of it is that the Gen X leaders there saw these kind of like problems within their religious context and were like, screw this. I'm not going to let these boomers ruin Christianity. I'm going to plant a
Hmm.
church. And then
Hmm.
once those same kind of things show up with millennials and younger, they're like, screw this. I'm going to have an Instagram influencer campaign. And like just where the angst or that desire to have a place, right, where these existential questions or the rumors of transcendence emerge in community or whatever, like there's one was like, let's create a whole network of people where you can show up in towns with your questions and get to become friends across all this different space. And the other's
Yeah.
like, I'm going to bitch about my past on the internet and attract other people with the same pain points, and the algorithm's going to help me. And as someone who's like an elder millennial, I don't know what to do with those younger than me because they're looking at me and they're like, Trip, your whole job as being an influencer, you have a platform. It just like yours looks a little more legitimate because you have a PhD. But I would much rather take the other option, right? And so, like maybe you could say kind of your thoughts as a sociologist of what was going on in the emerging church movement and how there's something shifting that shifted in the generations, where one response is no, we're gonna build new communities, and the others are like, I'm gonna become a influencer brand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, I mean, my observation, and I didn't study this in great depth, other scholars have more than I have, but my observation, and I knew some people that were in that movement and talked with some others, is, these were Gen Xers who realized where things were going. And part of it is, this is an oversimplification, but part of it is trying to respond intelligently, creatively, and faithfully to the influence of postmodernism. I show in the book postmodernism, it has roots in the 60s and whatever from Europe, but it really hits American higher education in the 90s and after. And I think some of these, I think it's in that case, it was a generational boomers versus Gen Xers. And the boomers just didn't get it. Like they couldn't get it. It didn't make sense to them. And the Gen Xers were like, don't you get this? And they were like, no. So there was a movement. It was significant. It generated a lot of interest and so on. But by my observation in the evangelical wing of things, the boomer leaders of evangelicalism saw it as a selling out and a threat to their structure of epistemology and a way of doing things, and basically just tried to shove it overboard. There was no that I could see. There was no sort of let's work on this, let's talk this out, let's learn from each other. And so it didn't get anything from the higher up, so to speak, that was really trying to help it. I think part of it is in the millennial zeitgeist, there are, like you're saying, each generation, the technological changes and the economic and now political changes are so quick and drastic that you just get children that have different sensibilities about like fundamental deep cultural commitments and ideas that don't it's just obvious to them the way something is, and they look at something that from the previous generation and say, that's not really it. So Millennials mostly said, I'm not religious or I'm spiritual. Some became atheists, not too many. And Gen Zers, that's interesting. Like, I don't know Gen Zer, like where that's going to go. I really have been focused on millennials here. I have numbers about Gen Zers, but they're so relatively young that there's not enough to really say something. But it appears that they're just going to carry on the same directions of obsolescence. It may be that Gen Xers and millennials turn out to be more interested in a culture and re-enchantment. Gen Zers may end up saying like, ghost hunting, and we're not really into that either. So I don't know where that's going, but the world that's out there now, to grow up in it, it's hard for me to imagine like how it's seen. My youngest is a Gen Zer, but she's a little different too. But how it feels and what seems real.
You talk about at the end of the book the uniqueness of both Black Protestantism in America and Judaism in America as having ways of resisting this drive towards disaffiliation. And I wonder what cultural, historical, or communal factors you see within these traditions that might explain it, and whether there are lessons that other religious traditions could potentially learn from those communities.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, historically, I think it's pretty well known that the Black church was sort of a essential core institution of survival and identity and community and protection, basically. And so there's a long-term inheritance that this institution really matters. However, some of the forces I've talked about, and also this is a little thin ice to get into, but Black family culture is a little bit different. There's a little bit more sense of authority. Like, like some of the way white kids talk to their parents, like black kids aren't allowed to do that. So maybe you should edit that out. I don't know if that's too controversial, but I think it's true. So there's a different subculture, and but many of the forces that I've been talking about are starting to impinge upon younger Black Americans. There's a growing readiness to consider maybe I'm just not religious. And so I know some a sociologist who studies this, and I know some people within these communities who are pretty worried, like, where is this going to go? We're not going to be able to, and they'll describe it like cell phones. How can my version of the gospel, this would be a pastor talking, ever compete with these shiny, instantaneous, like addictive instruments in their hands? Like they're worried about it. So American Judaism similarly also it's a small minority. It has a long history of being threatened and persecuted. So at the same time, the story I tell is that the biggest threat to American Judaism from their perspective has been intermarriage. There's been for a long time now growing like young Jews marrying non-Jews, and that feels like that's going to be a huge problem. However, I tell a story about how there was an intentional effort and a lot of finances invested into programs to try to turn that around. And actually, Jewish millennials, those raised age 16 as Jewish, who were millennials, are more likely or less likely to be not religious than Gen Xers. So their efforts seem to have had some influence in moving the needle. We'll see where things go now. I think the wars in Palestine complicate things. But on the other hand, Mormonism has been traditionally thought of as great at keeping their kids. They have a great tight pipeline. They're good at retention. And what I discovered in doing this, and one of the big surprises I discovered in doing this is actually Mormon kids are having Mormonism is having a huge defection of millennials. There's great numbers of defectors. It's the largest group of traditions of millennials who are leaving the faith. And one of the reasons I missed that earlier in life when I studied emerging adults is Mormons wait longer before they bail out of church. They don't do it when they're 18 or 23 because it's a much personally consequential, bigger thing to leave the Mormon church. So many wait until they're in their late 20s. But that's definitely happening. So again, there's different ironies and unexpected things going on here. A lot of what's going on with Mormonism is the internet, the ability to access information that you couldn't have gotten just living in Salt Lake City before. And there's a development of a Mormon, ex-Mormon community and when Mormons leave, they're not just like, okay, I'm out of here. They're like, many of them are very angry because they feel like they were lied to. They had their lives screwed up. This was borderline totalitarian. And so there's a whole community of ex-Mormons that are like support and help people get out of the church that has a lot more emotional energy running in it. So yeah, the story in my book is this overarching cultural historical thing, but then there's also some sub stories that have their own great deal of interest in them to me.
In the chapter on the 2000s, you talk about the kind of deep impact of 9/11 on American religion. And I was an undergrad at that point, and just the response of the majority of the Christian community at a Baptist school made me wonder if we were in the same religion, right? Where I'm like, the only thing I remember on 9/11, my roommate going, the only thing we know Jesus would tell us to do today is pray for our enemy, and no one's doing it. And I didn't end up, leaving Christianity, but I've never felt comfortable among evangelicals again, or trust anything that comes from it. If you can turn into Islamophobic warmongers and buy a lie for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
And it seems that from 2016 on, Trump has occasioned that, the response after Black Lives Matter, the COVID epidemic, and then now in his second administration, the kind of Christian nationalism, where evangelicals used to be this kind of apolitical sense, had this political turn, and now it's like they're falsifying their even like public commitments of the past for a kind of theopolitics that's so zero sum. I wonder if there are lessons to learn from the last time, from the 9/11 and its response, that might help us understand kind of what the long-term impact of what's going on now might be, or what people or what people of faith might need to make space for if you don't want a whole nother wave of people exiting, because it's just depressing. And moving back to the South after 15 years and Los Angeles and Edinburgh, and then seeing what it looks like up close, nothing intellectually changed to make Christianity just so less compelling because of the dominant expression. And I just look at peers that never migrated, their theological imagination never migrated. It just kind of stayed in track with evangelicalism, and I just kind of want to go like, you realize how many people in your metaphysical system are going to go to hell just because you love Donald Trump this much? Like, I don't even believe in hell, but nonetheless, like the actual consequence of they do the same thing about healthcare policy and unborn children. So
yeah, that is a huge and really big and important question. And I don't really have a great answer other than to say, I mean, I'm a sociologist, right? But I say, my impression these days is just American Christianity, or much of American Christianity, what at all does it have to do with the Gospels or the gospel or Jesus? Like, where is there any connection whatsoever? It feels just like it's become another religion. That's just my subjective reaction to things. But yeah, it may go back to, well, look, Christianity, Protestantism, especially Protestantism in America, have been wrapped up with each other forever. So it's hard for people to separate those. I would say my interpretation, not to make everything fit my story, but my interpretation of Christian nationalism is it's basically a symptom of the obsolescence of traditional religion. It's a greater desperation and a kind of not on the death throes, because I don't like death language, but yet earlier in the 80s and even into the 90s, the Christian right was saying, what we need are righteous men in political power we will save America by having righteous Christian men and women in power who will make laws that reflect, what we believe in. That's been completely, already that you could argue was mission drift for evangelicalism, but that's been completely abandoned to what we need now is any of the most ungodly man there was by our standards, who will protect us, who will keep us from being persecuted, who will keep us from, being wiped out by the liberals and all the other horrible people. So to me, that feels much more desperate than the Jerry Falwell Christian Coalition era. And its actions are reflect that desperation, I think, and it feels like a whole nother order of mission drift. If I were Billy Graham, I mean, not that he was a saint or anything, but if I were Billy Graham, I would be just turning over in my grave. Like, this is what I devoted my life to building up as an institution, is now become this. It boggles my mind. But again, lots of people sitting in pews are not that really well educated. They they believe in the Bible, but I don't know if they believe in Jesus, or they believe in sort of mediated versions of what they hear. You throw into that conspiracy, fake news, and everything else, it can just go crazy. I don't really have any answer.
There's one other question, and this I'm kind of interested in just because of your location at Notre Dame. When you think of this historical story, over the course of it, we've had three different popes, from John Paul II, Benedict Ratzinger, and Papa Francis. Well, how does the story you're telling, what role do the popes play in it, and is there something you think other religious traditions could learn from the Catholics' experience of that story, or or even like Pope Francis' ability to get way higher positive responses than other religious leaders to millennials and under?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of complex dimensions to this. This could be a whole conversation, but John Paul II was super popular with young people, at least committed Catholics, and then some less committed Catholics at least found him compelling. He had his problems, and he neglected some things in the church, but he was relatively compelling. He was a world historical figure. He clearly had integrity, et cetera, et cetera. I think that really appealed to young people. Benedict was a little bit on the kind of the aged, keep the ship running in the straight direction side. I don't mean to demean him. I think he had a real intellect, but the problem is what it takes to quote unquote appeal or be relevant to younger generations, to post boomers. I mean, to some degree, it's nice if young people find religious leaders appealing, or they're glad that they're hearing them saying something different about LGBTQ or something like that, like Pope Francis. But how much does that put the church in the position to form young people? Is the church in a formative position to sort of help over time reshape people's outlooks and assumptions and values and commitments, versus just, I have my pre-established reality, and if religious leaders live up to it, I'll like them, and if they don't, they won't. And that is, it's kind of a consumerist orientation. Now, of course, and then there's conservative Catholics who think that they will be the sort of the salvation of the church, and a lot of them don't like Pope Francis. So one of the Catholic Church's big problems is internal polarization and division. And this is prior to, this goes back to the end of Vatican II. It's a huge problem. And also related to that is Catholics becoming mainstream. I mean, there wasn't that many generations ago when most Catholics were in urban working class inner city ghettos, where your Catholic community and your parish and your priest was kind of your whole life. Whereas now, with the suburbanization and massive higher education increases among Catholics, the question is less. I mean, it used to be like, what does it mean to be an American as a Catholic? And now I think the question is, what does it mean to be a Catholic as an American Catholic? So I just think it's a complicated situation. The role of the popes are working cut in different directions, I think. But I think that I would say sociologically, they are washed over. Any effect of any pope is overwhelmed by other larger social cultural forces, like the kind I describe in my book. If somebody wants to maintain sort of a committed Catholic faith, it helps them to have a pope they like and believe in. Like, something to hold on to. That's an encouragement. But in and of itself, it's just one force among many.
Yeah, I know, having spent quite a bit of time in the uh, environmental movement especially in the academy when I was at the University of Edinburgh, the number of non-Catholics who found Catholicism compelling because the Pope was a lot more clear about the ecological crisis and the impact of our economic system on the poor and the planet. it was one of these fascinating things where you have,
Yeah,
like postdocs and stuff that were culturally Christian now interested in Catholicism because
yeah,
he had a tradition to speak from and an expectation of fidelity that even like the corporations can't have. Academic institutions are often not incentivized to, as the way we do our funding. And so, in that space, Francis had a kind of alluring space to speak from, precisely
yeah.
because he was the Pope.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think the Pope still really matters in the world. I mean, CNN will cover everything that's going on, with the Pope and so on. And I think that the more different versions of Protestantism grow thinner and thinner and become really don't feel like they have much substance, the more Catholicism appeals to some of those people. And there will be some that, and historically, this is a long trend, especially Anglicans becoming Catholic. There's a Catholic revival of famous authors in the early 20th century. Like this happens in waves, but whether those waves become like big, whether they really shape, like for every young person in who finds the Pope compelling and wants to explore Catholicism, there's 100 others who are just working at Burger King or whatever, and they don't pay attention.
In many ways, the story you tell in the book is one where more and more parts of culture are upstream of religion, and then religious institutions are trying to make sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, at like recognizing that as a sociologist, if you have advice for faith community leaders who sit there on a regular basis going, why is my congregation that might be like increasingly politically in the same tribe now placing expectations on me of what I'm supposed to talk about, as
Yeah.
opposed to anticipating, an encounter with the word or like any type of preaching. It seems that there's both that drive towards self-sorting at the religious level, and then and it does so by prescribing to religious leaders less and less space where the tradition can speak in any kind of tensive ways towards the center of the tribe. And I get hundreds of emails where clergy are like, "What do I do about that?"
Yeah, I'm not sure what to do, but this reflects long term cultural transformations whereby when a religious tradition had authority to teach and form people, that's been gradually eroded away. And so the authority now is the individual. They decide what they want. We've been trained to be consumers. We've been trained to be our own gatekeepers on the internet. The internet wiped out any idea that there's a gatekeeper who will tell you what's worth paying attention to. So we all are thrown back on ourselves now to figure out what we believe, what our opinion is. And so you have people coming to church. They may still want to be Christians. They still may value their tradition, whatever it is. But underneath of all that, they as an individual are essentially consumers. They're not submitting themselves to the influence of the tradition. They in another book I describe, Americans generally, or the religion functions as an optional identity accessory. It's like something. It's like you buy a car. Well, would you like to have this ornament on the front, and you want to have leather seats or whatever? Like people are piecing together their lives, and religion may or may not be part of that, but it's kind of an accessory you may add into your life. It's the with few some exceptions. It's not sort of the underlying rock bottom identity and life commitment and source of knowledge. Many will say this, oh, I believe in a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview, but in fact, their whole cultural orientation is profoundly governed by American individualism and neoliberal capitalism and everything else we're talking about. So, how to say this? I don't pity pastors. I empathize with the difficult position that religious leaders and clergy especially are in, trying to say, hey, this is what our tradition teaches. You got to take that seriously without having everyone get up and walk out the door, because they've already decided they'll decide what the truth is.
Yeah, that description of the role of kind of consumerism and the way the individual subject in American religious spiritual space functions. It's like the inverse of of Kierkegaard's Denmark, like where everyone's a Christian, so no one's a true one. Well, now everyone's a consumerist, so no one can ever hear the gospel, right? Because
Right.
like the conditions for the possibility of responding to anything comes with the consumerist subject, which is
Yeah.
which is definitely not one that understands what the category Lord would ever mean, or find
Yeah.
the form of disciple, something more grandiose than Bonhoeffer's cheap grace. And so like that's one of the reasons I like getting done with this book. My like general critique of capitalism on behalf of all sorts of other reasons, like, oh yeah, it's bad for the planet, the poor, and I'd like my grandkids to breathe. The other side of it is that the way that this consumerist framework is actually like undermine the ability of any of our historic wisdom traditions to offer to the human subject the ability to take its own self seriously, recognize its value in a web of meaning, and think that its agency towards its neighbor and its enemy and its non-human neighbors, it matters at all. Right. And so to me, it got like I got done reading it. It was like helpful to find language. You have all these amazing metaphors, but so many people spend so much time obsessed with the content of all these different religious traditions and prioritizing them. And it just seems that the very context of American religion in the present is anti-religious, while all these different it's anti-faith, and then it lets you decide if you want to be religious or spiritual.
Yeah. The book is about an atmosphere. It's about a zeitgeist, something big up here. At another level, it's another big emphasis of the book is deep culture, not just the stuff floating on the surface, but the deepest commitments and expectations and assumptions, presuppositions that are below levels of reflective consciousness. It's just what people take to be because they're so embedded in institutions and practices of life that what really has made religion obsolete is that the underlying deep culture structures have been transformed over time, but when people didn't even realize it was happening or couldn't at least name it. And once those deep cultural structures are set, you just can't turn on a dime. Like that takes a long time for them to adjust. And in our case, deep cultural structures are profoundly influenced by political economy. It's not that I'm a Marxist, but they just are. It's not just that, but and technologies that feed into those.
Yeah. Well, is there something I missed that I should ask about? I really enjoyed reading the book and
I'm
really
glad.
appreciate you hanging out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really trying to help people understand things better, more than tell people what to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think, from the point of view of traditional religion, or there's one other thing I would say. Based on what you just said, it's very hard times for traditional religion now. But the structure of things, of mass consumer capitalism, of individualism, the structure and the tone and feel of the zeitgeist is much more friendly to what I'm calling a culture of re-enchantment, because that's open, it's entertaining. There's a light side, there's a dark side. You can be messing with it, you can be very serious with it. There are a lot of doorways and entryways to get into that and explore it without being committed. So I think the structure of the world of a culture is much more plausible and sustainable in our current situation than traditional religion, which is why I say people aren't leaving religion to become secularists. They're moving into these other spheres. So it's not that there are no options. It's just that the traditional religion, as it's been received, as it's sort of developed, things are really in its if people read my book, they should say, wow, traditional religion is in real trouble, because it's not just we've lost some members. Like the zeitgeist, we totally mismatch it. And so therefore, if there's going to be any constructive response, it's not just going to require, oh, let's try this program or let's emphasize this more. I think it's going to require some deep soul searching about what are we? Like, what are we committed to? How many people are we willing to lose by getting back to what we think is a more faithful version of ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And none of that has guaranteed any happy outcome. So, but yeah, it is what it is, as the zeitgeist says. And that's my job, is to try to tell. I call them like I sees them. So that's how it looks to me.
Well, I appreciate it, and looking forward to hearing how people end up responding to the book. It's been wonderful to get to talk to you, having read a number of your books. It's all when the imagined version of you it turns out not to be even as much fun as the real one, then it's always a good time.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's fun. I hope this is helpful to your podcast followers, and I hope all of this generates some important discussion.
All right.